is Rinor Jani, and I am the conference chair and a UN representative for Pathways to Peace. I am proud to welcome all of you to our momentous virtual event, an intergenerational approach to advancing the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This event commemorates the International Day for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons and underscores the importance of the TPNW. This event is sponsored by Pathways to Peace, Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, Peace Boat US, and the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. We have all gathered today because our world still faces the scourge of nuclear weapons, an existential threat facing our humanity.
Here, listen to this.
To address this threat, it is imperative that we strengthen the momentum and advocacy for the total ban on nuclear weapons through working with youth activists and elders. We must all support the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, TPNW, and shift the discourse towards human security. We only need 5 more ratifications before it enters into force and becomes part of international law. We have seen throughout history, when elders and youth join forces in peaceful solidarity, profound results are accelerated and achieved. The youth have stepped up their activism in the movements of climate justice, racial equality, female empowerment, and nuclear disarmament. They have brought their enthusiasm, resiliency, and strength. And the elders have brought their wisdom and have begun to mentor them. We all need to stand at the front lines together, and this is why we are gathering today, to learn and discuss how we can all work in solidarity to support the entry into force of the TPNW. We must establish safe spaces for youth activists and elders to engage with one another and forge partnerships towards the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. Today, in the spirit of unity between youth activists and elders, we are convening this intergenerational event. This event includes distinguished diplomats who were involved in the negotiations of the TPNW, leading activists who are affiliated with ICAN, and elders from the First Nations. Now, I would like to introduce Betsabe Reyna, who will be moderating our conference today. Betsabe is a UN representative for Pathways to Peace. Her passion and goal are to raise awareness and propose solutions for regions afflicted with a religious conflict. A previous spokesperson for UNICEF Voices of Youth, Betsabe collaborated with Calvary Chapel Old Bridge to spread love, restoration, and hope across many countries. Betsabe has prepared individuals to better serve refugees requiring humanitarian aid. She was and remains driven by the call for human rights of persecuted peoples who are forced to flee their homes. Betsabe, the floor is yours.
My colleague, thank you, Rinor Jani. Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I am honored to moderate this special panel, an intergenerational approach to advancing the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It is encouraging to see so many dedicated to a high-level collective vision of a nuclear weapons-free world. We will now begin to hear the panelists' statements, and I kindly remind each invited panelist to stay in between the timeframe set to allow all to be heard and all others to remain muted. Excellencies, Ambassador Maritza Valverde, Deputy Permanent Representative to the Permanent Mission of Costa Rica to the United Nations. I invite you to take the floor.
Good morning, everyone. I want to begin by thanking Pathways to Peace, now Peace Boat USA, and TPNW for inviting me to speak here today. Human security, a more democratic multilateral system, and international law all require nuclear disarmament. According to ICAN, every minute, nuclear weapon states spend $138,699 on the production and modernization of nuclear weapons. The disproportionate and multi-million-dollar investment that nuclear arms states perform in terms of the production, maintenance, and modernization of nuclear weapons could be used to promote the paradigm shift that Costa Ricans long for in that human security and international law take precedence over the deterrence doctrine and the threat of use of force, including through nuclear weapons. Amid the COVID-19 pandemic, collective human security and the well-being of our citizens must be placed at the center of policymaking, where peace and security must be seen as a global public good. This good is not obtained by multiplying and modernizing nuclear weapons, nor is it achieved by unilateral and or bilateral reductions that are not verifiable, transparent, and conducted under the watchful eye of the International Atomic Energy Agency, nor is obtained by delaying the conference of the establishment of a Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. Peace and security as a global public good come in part from honoring the Charter of the United Nations, especially Articles 10 and 26, compliance with which Costa Rica has advocated for decades. In short, peace and security require more than arms control. It requires addressing climate change, reducing inequality, eliminating extreme poverty. It requires investing in gender equality, political inclusion, social cohesion, and good governance. Resources is increasingly needed now by all states to eradicate COVID-19 and mitigate its impacts, and to ensure the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, just to name a few examples. Peace and security as a global public good are not built on force, but rather on a more democratic multilateral system. The paralysis of the Conference on Disarmament, which is not representative of the total membership of this organization of the UN, has motivated many states, including my own, and so many thousands of people from civil society organizations, universities, think tanks, and parliamentarians to demand concrete actions in order to initiate negotiations on a feasible material cut-off treaty, as well as the movement that led the adoption of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This is why international law is called to play a leading role. International law requires that all of us accept it without exceptions. Our solemn obligation is to ensure that the principles of the UN Charter and those of the treaties are applied coherently and are defended as universal truth. When these principles are trampled on, ignored, or applied selectively or without consequences, it weakens the organization and the international system of governance that we established after World War II. A selective focus also weakens our collective security. This focus has allowed those states possessing nuclear weapons to ignore or threaten to ignore their obligations under the NPT, while demanding that other states comply with them. This same focus presumes that there are right hands for the wrong weapons, weapons that will be finally outlawed with the prompt entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I invite all states that have not done so to sign and ratify this historic treaty. The treaty is grounded on the recognition that nuclear weapons can pose a threat to global health, the environment, food security, and development. The obligation to comply with the obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law, and the recognition that a legally binding provision of nuclear weapons constitutes an important contribution towards the achievement and maintenance of a world free of nuclear weapons, including the irreversible, verifiable, and transparent elimination of nuclear weapons, and the determination to act towards that end. Moreover, the treaty recalls the obligation to engage in nuclear disarmament negotiations in good faith, and the standing of the NPT and the CTBT in the nuclear disarmament regime. The treaty is the first step for nuclear weapons and their unacceptable humanitarian and environmental consequences to be prohibited and subsequently eliminated, as it has been the case with other weapons of mass destruction. The treaty also acknowledges the needs of victims, as well as the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons have on women and girls and on indigenous populations. It makes reference to the risk of detonations by accident, calculation, or design, and above all, it establishes explicit provisions so that these weapons are never, under any circumstance, produced, tested, or transferred, or used in any other way. The entry into force of the TPNW will be a triumph for multilateralism at a time of great uncertainty. This new international instrument responds to the imperative of our provisions and contains a roadmap for the total elimination of nuclear weapons. And one of the reasons why this treaty is so important is that this new international instrument is a beacon in a new era of nuclear politics in which the non-nuclear majority of states can lead the way in charting the course towards a nuclear weapon-free world. I thank you.
I thank you, Ambassador Maritza Chan Valverde, for your introductory remarks. Now I give the floor to Francis Collins, Deputy Director of the Department and Non-Proliferation Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade of Ireland, on topic 1, shifting the narrative to human security, presenting the road towards the TPNW.
Ambassador Chan, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to address you as part of this webinar on an intergenerational approach to advancing the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Today, we will discuss important themes of humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, youth engagement and activism, and the diversity of voices, which are very much reflected in the treaty and are indicative of the preoccupations which drove states and civil societies who were to the forefront of the treaty negotiations. I would like to thank the organisers for inviting me to address you today on the road to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons from an Irish perspective. As you know, Ireland ratified the TPNW on the 6th of August this year, becoming the 41st country to do so. It was fitting that Ireland ratified the treaty on the day that marked 75 years since the US atomic bombing of Hiroshima, a day we remember all those who have lost their lives and pay tribute to the dignity, courage, and resilience of those who survived, as well as other victims and survivors who continue to suffer the enduring aftermath of thousands of nuclear tests that occurred in the second half of the 20th century. Achieving a world free from the threat of nuclear weapons is a long-standing priority for Ireland, which lists disarmament and non-proliferation as one of our 5 signature foreign policies. The Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT, 50 years old this year, has its origins in a series of Irish resolutions first put forward at the UN in 1958. At that time, Ireland's then Foreign Minister, Mr. Frank Aiken, vocalised the fears of many across the globe, and particularly small state nations such as our own, about the existential threat posed by the existence of nuclear weapons, magnified at that time by a context of climbing international tensions, proliferation of nuclear weapons, and a growing awareness of the impact of nuclear weapons testing. He said then, and I quote, "As a potential nuclear victim who is not a nuclear scientist, I find it difficult to take any great interest in whether the efficiency of nuclear weapons is still further improved to the point where the world could be destroyed 20 or 100 times over. What does concern me deeply as a representative of a small nation is the constantly increasing danger to which the people of my country and other countries are exposed. From the very outset of Ireland's engagement in nuclear disarmament, the overriding concern has been the existential threat posed by nuclear weapons to humanity and the planet. The humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons continues to drive Ireland's engagement on nuclear disarmament to this day. As a state and as a people, we are proud of the legacy of our association with the NPT and see it very much as an illustration of the contribution a small country like Ireland can make to international peace and security. Ireland continues to champion the universalisation and the full implementation of the NPT. Efforts we will continue to make not only at the upcoming review conference, but in the years and decades ahead. There is one pillar where progress on the implementation of the NPT has fallen short: nuclear disarmament. Unlike the other pillars, there are very few supporting regimes for disarmament, and attempts to strengthen the disarmament provisions of the NPT have traditionally been fiercely resisted, in particular by nuclear weapon states. For example, commitments made in the NPT action plans from 2000 and 2010 remained unfulfilled, and their status is called into question. And 22 years since the opening for signature, the CTBT has yet to enter into force. It is fair to say that the lack of progress on disarmament under the NPT was also a consideration behind the TPNW. The same commitment to multilateralism that drove Ireland in the 50s and 60s informed the Irish approach to the historic TPNW negotiations in 2017. The NPT always envisaged a separate legal instrument to give effect to its disarmament provisions. Having championed the NPT from its inception, it was only fitting that Ireland played a leadership role once again in drafting with our core group members, Austria, Brazil, Mexico, Nigeria, and South Africa, the UN resolution which led to the negotiation of the TPNW. I would also like to recognise the significant contribution of Costa Rica, whose representative, Ambassador Gomez, so ably chaired the conference. In terms of the timing of the negotiations, it is important to recall that in the second decade of the century, new momentum on nuclear disarmament had been built up through the humanitarian initiative. The 2010 NPT Review Conference outcome document for the first time expressed concern on the catastrophic humanitarian consequences resulting from any nuclear weapons destination. A series of conferences on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons held in 2012 and 2014 highlighted, firstly, that the risk of an accidental or deliberate detonation of a nuclear weapon is far higher than previously thought. And secondly, that there is no global response capacity which could adequately address the aftermaths of a nuclear weapons detonation. These conferences were instrumental in paving the way for the negotiations in 2017, and even more so in ensuring the ultimate success of the negotiations. Many, both inside and outside the negotiations, had been surprised at the pace of the process and the delivery of the treaty by the 7th of July deadline, especially given the lack of prepcoms. However, 3 humanitarian conferences had served as very important learning experience for states involved in the negotiation. The 2016 open-ended working group, which ran for 3 weeks from January to August in Geneva, had produced a comprehensive final report, which was hugely important, both in terms of increasing the knowledge and expertise of the delegations, and in creating a sense of urgency and common purpose. In assessing the impact of the TPNW and its negotiations, we should equally mark its contribution as to how treaties on international peace and security can be negotiated. The TPNW negotiations are notable for the diverse engagement by those not usually heard in disarmament fora, including developing countries, small island states, female voices, and survivors of nuclear weapons tests. Often, both in Geneva at the open-ended working group and in New York at the negotiations, these new voices were amongst the strongest in the room. Their very powerful statements and interventions, often based on personal experience, served as something as a tipping point, definitively shifting the debate away from the traditional hard national and regional security arguments towards human, collective security and more innovative solutions and collaborative approaches. The role of civil society and experts, in particular the medical community, was also incredibly important and powerful. A remarkable number of female delegates attended the proceedings and were active in the negotiations, in stark contrast to the norm in disarmament fora. The result was a treaty which, apart from its robust core provisions with regard to nuclear weapons, has also included groundbreaking and far-reaching provisions on the environment, on disarmament education, on the gendered impact of nuclear weapons, and on the equal participation of women and men in the future work of the treaty. The treaty now adopted is the first time that a group of states have agreed to ban nuclear weapons entirely and immediately. In doing so, it gives legal expression to the nuclear disarmament provisions contained in the NPT. It is the first new legal multilateral instrument on nuclear disarmament to be adopted in over 20 years. It gives back agency to non-nuclear weapon states such as Ireland, to civil society, to every man, woman, and young person on this planet who are threatened by the very existence of the most powerful and most indiscriminate weapons of mass destruction ever invented. Ireland is proud to have ratified the treaty and of the part we played in the negotiations. We look forward to its early entry into force and continuing to work with you all for the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. I thank you.
I thank you, Deputy Director Francis Collins. I now have the honor to invite Alicia Sanders-Zakre, Policy and Research Coordinator to ICAN, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, to take over the floor presenting the impact of the TPNW's entry into force and civil society's efforts. You now have the floor.
Great, thank you so much for having me and for the excellent statements we've had so far. It's a tough act to follow, but I'm glad to be here today. I'm the Policy and Research Coordinator with ICAN, which is a global campaign of more than 600 organizations in more than 100 countries, all with the common goal of banning and eliminating nuclear weapons. And one of the primary ways in which we're working to do that is through our advocacy for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which by now you've had a pretty superb overview of the thinking behind the treaty and the process leading towards its adoption at the UN in 2017. So the next kind of big step for the treaty and for our campaign is when the treaty will enter into force and take full legal effect. And that happens 90 days, 3 months after the 50th state decides to ratify or accede to the treaty and agree to be fully bound by it. So currently we have 45 countries that have done so. So we just need 5 more countries to ratify the treaty for it to take full legal effect. And this is a major moment for the campaign, for the stigmatization of nuclear weapons leading towards their eventual elimination. But it also can sound a bit legal jargony to talk about the entry into force of this international treaty. So one thing that we've been working to do is to explain exactly what it means when this treaty will enter into force. So I'll just kind of go through that with you now and kind of explain why this is important for the campaign and what campaigners will be doing around this moment. And this is something that anyone can get involved in. So I've dropped, unfortunately I did not prepare visuals today, but I did drop the briefing paper in the chat. So, feel free if you want to get more information about kind of what I'm going through now, just to follow that link. You can follow along as I speak, or, look it up after. But essentially, what the treaty's entry into force means can be kind of broken down into two different categories. One is the new legal obligations for the countries that have ratified it or acceded, who have agreed to be legally bound by it. And the other is the possible political normative impact of the entry into force of the treaty on states that have not joined it. And this is through advancing the norm against nuclear weapons that is kind of enshrined in this treaty, as has been discussed. So I'll just mention a few of these kind of new legal obligations first for states parties, and then go into the other side of it. So there are some kind of smaller technical legal obligations for states parties, like submitting a declaration to kind of announce if that country has ever had nuclear weapons, to have an agreement with the international agency that monitors nuclear programs. And then there are some kind of more substantial and really interesting obligations for states parties that, again, states parties will be legally required to begin implementing after entry into force. So one of these is just a legal obligation to adopt national legislation to implement the obligations and prohibitions under the treaty. So my distinguished colleague from Ireland has already adopted a national implementation measure to do so, and it's something we'll expect from all states parties after entry into force. Another kind of really interesting and exciting obligation is for states parties to provide assistance for people who have been impacted by nuclear weapons use and testing, as well as to work towards the remediation of environments that have been contaminated by nuclear weapons use and testing. And in the treaty, this is for those states parties that have people or places impacted by nuclear weapons in their territory. It's kind of their primary responsibility to work towards assistance and remediation. But it's also the obligation of all states parties in a position to do so to contribute and help towards this obligation. Also, and kind of under this umbrella, all states parties are obligated to help other states parties with implementing the treaty, whether that's with, again, helping those who've been impacted by nuclear weapons use and testing, helping other states to develop this legislation to implement the treaty, and so forth. And another obligation is for states parties to encourage those states that have not joined the treaty to join and to help universalize the treaty. Of course, there's a core list of prohibitions for states parties not to conduct nuclear weapons activities, essentially. And all of those prohibitions, again, will be fully in force for the states that have joined it after the entry into force of the treaty. And just to know, within 1 year of the entry into force. So that's, I know all these timelines can be confusing, but within, 3 months after the 50th state has ratified the treaty, it's the entry into force, and then within 1 year of that entry into force date will be the first meeting of all of the countries that have joined the treaty to really discuss how to implement the treaty, how to provide this assistance for victims, how to remediate environments that have been contaminated by nuclear weapons use, to really delve into making the treaty actionable. And it's a really, again, exciting moment, and will certainly be kind of encouraging full participation, getting input from civil society, from relevant actors for those decisions. So that that's kind of the clear explanation of how this treaty will impact the states that have joined. But what about the states that haven't joined? And this, I think, is a particularly important place for civil society to get involved. So we've seen with previous weapons prohibition treaties, specifically with the treaty banning landmines, as well as the treaty banning cluster munitions, that there can actually be an impact of these treaties entering into force on non-states parties. And we've seen that in a few particular buckets of behavior. Again, feel free to check out the paper that I posted in the chat for more specific examples of this. But just as a broad overview, we saw after the entry into force of the mine ban treaty and the Convention on Cluster Munitions, that there were some companies in countries that had not joined the treaty that stopped producing the prohibited weapon. We also saw that there were financial institutions based in countries that had not joined the treaty that stopped investing in companies that produced these weapons. And we even saw that there were some countries that had not joined these treaties that changed their policies on the use and transfer of this prohibited weapon. So we know from the past there is possibility for this to really shape even non-states parties. And the question is why? If there's no legal obligation, why are we seeing this change in behavior? And one answer to that question is that the norm is changing. It's no longer acceptable to be producing these weapons. It's no longer acceptable to be investing in companies that are producing these weapons, or to have policies that you can use these weapons based on the clear humanitarian consequences of these weapons that is brought forth and highlighted within these treaties. So this is the role for civil society, is to make it clear that in countries that have not joined the treaty, who continue to rely on these weapons in their security doctrines, who continue to possess these weapons, that there is a new legal standard that clearly says that these weapons are not acceptable because of their humanitarian consequences. And there are many ways that civil society can be continuing to push this message in these states, including by prompting further debates. We know that there are well over 1,000 elected representatives in countries that have not joined the Prohibition Treaty, who have pledged to work to get their country to join. This is an opportunity for those representatives to be bringing this up within parliaments, within the media. And of course, there's a role for protests. There's a role for actions. Ultimately, this is a big moment, a big campaigning moment, and it's up to us to make the most of it. So with that, I'd encourage you just to check out our social media for kind of additional information on what's going on, and find a way to get involved. Thanks.
I thank you, Alicia Sanders-Zakre. Now I have the pleasure to give the floor to Kelvin Kibet, International Medical Student Representative, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985 on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. You now have the floor, Kelvin.
This meeting with all of you. It's always a pleasure because when young people are able to gather for a good cause, it ends up being a big movement. The Disarmament movement in the 1980s was one of the big movements at that time and has continued to dwindle down. And this is a very important conversation that we are having now to try and bring generations together. As a medical doctor, new medical doctor, just 1 year now practicing, it always baffles me when a new diagnosis and a new disease comes through and I have to struggle to find my way through because maybe there's no medication and there's no equipment, depending on which hospital I'm working in. And I think this must be the same situation that finds us in the event of nuclear war. Taking you back to 1995, when the first atomic bomb was dropped and in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there are so many people that lost their lives. 70,000 in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, around more than 80,000 people. But what was important there was that despite all these calamities, there was no way to rescue those fatalities and casualties because of the 298 physicians who were in Hiroshima, 270 died and the other were injured. So there was no one to try and save them. There was more than 1,500 nurses in the same city, but there more than 1,200 were also involved in the blast. And so there was absolutely no possibility to try and save casualties. The hostels were destroyed and there's almost no way of trying to come back from such a situation. And just immediately after that, it's not like an accident which as soon as it happens, then that is, there's no repercussions. Because until now, the Hibakusha, which are the survivors of the nuclear war, continue to feel the effects of the radiation sickness and leukemias and cancers since 1945. Their generations continue to feel the effect of having lost so many of the relatives. Some generations were completely exterminated from the face of the earth. So these situations as a doctor always baffled me. And now, straight after 1945, it did not stop there. As if that was not enough, the world continued with more and more testing. And testing, despite not being a nuclear war, still has almost the same effects as well, because so many, if you look at places like Marshall Islands where testing has been done, there's a lot of people who are suffering from the effects of radiations. And the radiation from nuclear weapons is in such, if you think about an X-ray, which is a form of radiation, and then CT scans are like probably 400 times more than a single X-ray, you can imagine how much a nuclear blast can cause, just including testing and nuclear power. All of these radiation effects are felt by people who have no intention of going to war and people whose environments and whose families are being affected by what we're trying to think of is unimaginable, but actually happened years back. So as we continue to do this, there's many places that have been affected, including places where uranium mining is done. And if you look at countries like Niger, where uranium mining is mined for the export to be used for nuclear weapons, in these countries, the environment is so devastated that the people who are living in those areas are unable to have clean water. The nuclear waste that is left there continues to affect their lives. And this is unimaginable. The people living there some of them do not understand why this uranium mining is done, because some of them do not even have the funds, do not get the financial benefits from the uranium mining that's being exported from their countries. So as we continue to see, there's each and every step of the nuclear chain is just crazy, because there's absolutely no benefit in terms of world peace. There's absolutely no benefit in terms of where it comes from. The people who mine uranium do not benefit. The countries which stockpile the nuclear weapons do not benefit. And those who have been affected by nuclear war continue to feel the effects 70 years and more after. When we celebrated the anniversary this year, one of the big anniversaries this year, it was just heartbreaking to see how it still psychologically damages some of the Hibakusha, and even all of us in this world, to just know that there are weapons that exist anywhere that could actually wipe us from the face of the earth. I would like to take you back to now the current times that we live in. We are being faced with the COVID pandemic that is being felt in every part of the world. If you juxtapose the nuclear situation versus the COVID pandemic, ICAN has made really nice juxtaposition where we see how much money is spent for stabilizing nuclear reactors versus how much is being spent for corona and for other diseases such as malaria. And you can see that should we have just spent even a fraction of the money that is being spent on nuclear disarmament, we would have ended malaria. We would have been able to save so many of lives that are being lost to the current pandemic. But the conversation is not happening at that level at which people need to understand how much we have invested in weapons that are meant to destroy us versus how little we are spending in what is needed to save our lives. So I'm really happy that this conversation is happening, and I would just like to know that even those who are living in countries where there's no nuclear weapons, like the African region, we are still faced by the potential of a nuclear war. And I'll take you to a research done by Dr. Ira, who is one of the co-presidents of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. And in it, he did a research that shows that should there be a nuclear war just between two cities, say Mumbai and Pakistan, if a nuclear war is detonated, a nuclear weapon is detonated at Mumbai, that is now at this moment, it's devastating, because just 3 kilometers radius
Okay, I think Kelvin is frozen now, unfortunately.
Sorry that I
Okay.
got let out of the meeting somehow.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
so
welcome
I was just
back.
giving a scenario of what would happen if there's thank you. Giving a situation of what would happen in the event of a nuclear war in Mumbai and Pakistan, because the kind of nuclear weapons we have now is each of them is just almost 100 times stronger than the ones that were used in 1945 in the Second World War. This would mean that in 3 kilometer radius, everything will evaporate and vanish. And then even close up to 80 kilometers, there'll be fires and blasts. Buildings will be destroyed all over, or more than 80 kilometers away from the radiation area. And more importantly, for countries that do not have nuclear weapons, is that the amount of dust, nuclear dust, that will be let into the ozone layer will completely block any sunlight from reaching the atmosphere that we live in, which will mean that we'll have nuclear famine and nuclear winter that will affect the whole earth for more than 10 years. Currently, we don't have enough crops. We don't have enough. We're even facing climate change of unprecedented magnitude. You can imagine what it would mean to have any sort of nuclear accident or nuclear war at this time. We're unable to cope with the current situation. What would it be like if we had a nuclear war, even in just a small part of the city, or part of the world, like Mumbai, or based on that research? So I'm really encouraged that you're having this conversation, between generations, to try and bridge the gap between elders and youth. And it's important that we catch the fire now, because even though we are almost approaching TPNW getting into force, it doesn't mean that it stops there. It means that we can now push for the momentum to actually eliminate the nuclear weapons. Because if we reach at 50 and we reach to 100 countries, it doesn't mean that the nuclear weapons have been eliminated. It just means that we all are united in eliminating, and we need to push for this. And the best way to do this is for all youth to gather together in such movements, in such power, in such vigor, so that we all together speak in one voice and end nuclear weapons. I'm really looking forward to this conversation continuing, and thank you very much.
I thank you, Kelvin Kibet, for your statements. Your work is so important and vital for the people affected by nuclear materials, so thank you for that. Finally, I invite Anna Ikeda, Program Associate of SGI. You may now have the floor.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and hello to everyone. I'm really happy to join this panel today, commemorating the International Day for the total elimination of nuclear weapons. And I think it's quite important that this event focuses on the intergenerational approach to advance the TPNW, because as we just heard from Kelvin, the issue of nuclear weapons affects everyone. And I really mean everyone in the world. And yet, I believe one of the challenges we often face is that the issue of nuclear weapons is somehow perceived as something so far removed from people's day-to-day reality. And this means that many people may lack the awareness that it's an issue we must address with urgency. Or even if they know about it, they may feel like it's something beyond their influence and that they cannot really make any difference. And I believe this is true, especially for young people. But in reality, the disarmament community is not for just political leaders, diplomats, scientists, or academics. As Alicia highlighted the role of civil society, there are countless everyday people, so to speak, making a difference by working toward the early entry into force and the universalization of the TPNW every day. And by nature, the movement for the abolition of nuclear weapons is intergenerational. I'm sure all of us in the movement take inspiration from the resilience and strength of the hibakusha, the survivors of the atomic bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as survivors of nuclear testing, whose stories constantly remind us the reason why we fight the fight. My organization, SGI, has worked toward the world without nuclear weapons since 1957, and many of our activities are led by the youth. For example, we have held opportunities where young people in Japan can listen to the testimonies of the hibakusha directly, and that has always been impactful. One of the participants in such an event said that there's nothing more powerful than listening to testimonies of hibakusha because it stirs your emotions. Facts do not move your heart, and without that, you would not be driven to take action. What we also find, and this relates to today's theme of intergenerational approach, is that involving youth has energized older generations, particularly the hibakusha. For instance, one Hiroshima survivor recalled that in 2012, he attended a nuclear disarmament event with the Soka Gakkai youth, where his friend was the speaker. He said, and I quote, "It was inspiring to meet many young people in the event. I reflected how I, despite being a survivor, have not yet taken any action toward peace till then." And that's how he himself started to speak up against nuclear weapons. Youth play an essential role in creating a world free of nuclear weapons, and including their voices is critical in multilateral disarmament discussions, just like any other issues that affect our society so deeply. For this reason, Amplify, the International Youth Network for Nuclear Abolition, I support in an advisory capacity, brought delegations to many multilateral disarmament conferences at the UN, including the negotiations on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in 2017. Through our statements, working papers, and briefings with delegates, we emphasized the importance of youth participation in the negotiations and advanced and advocated for the importance of peace and disarmament education to help advance complete disarmament. I hope that youth will continue to have a presence at disarmament discussions in the future, including the upcoming NPT and the first meeting of states parties of the TPNW once the treaty enters into force. Since the treaty's adoption in 2017, civil society has played an active role in the efforts toward the entry into force, which is just 5 more ratifications away. Many actions have involved our young campaigners who have brought in creativity and energy to the movement. And there is still a lot of work to be done even after the entry into force until the day nuclear weapons are completely abolished. If you are a young person unsure about how to get involved or where to begin, there are a number of opportunities. There are some youth networks and groups working on the issue of nuclear weapons, Amplify being one. Another example I'm aware of and supporting is the World Conference Youth Assembly, where we gathered over 370 youth from around the world virtually in May to discuss the connections between nuclear weapons, climate crisis, and racial and economic justice, with a specific focus on how to build movements in the era of COVID-19 and beyond. We will be organizing again next year toward the NPT Review Conference, which has been postponed from this year. We heard from Alicia that ICAN has 600 partner organizations around the world, and there are many others that work for nuclear abolition. I'm sure you're able to find one in your country or community. In some groups, you may find yourself to be one of a very few youth, and therefore you might feel out of place. But I believe it's important that every group include young people's voices, and your presence and participation will benefit the movement greatly. If you are university students, you can find out, for example, if your school is involved in nuclear weapons production through research or financial investments. And if you find this is the case, you can spread the word, demand transparency, and call on your university to be part of the solution, not to be part of the problem. Those are just a few examples of how youth can and have already been involved. Because nuclear weapons affect everyone, we need to involve everyone to create solutions, people from every generation. Personally, I'm moved and inspired by the stories of activists and survivors who have been working on this issue for decades. It is thanks to their continuous work over the course of many years that we are able to keep moving forward. And yet, we need to keep inspiring younger generations, as this is a multi-generational issue, and at times, progress can be slow. From my experience, engaging young people in this issue can be a challenge, especially for longer term. Young people have shifting priorities, many changes in life, and it does not help that professional opportunities in this field are rather limited. We must ensure that youth feel they are making meaningful contributions and tangible impacts if we were to ensure that our movement keeps growing into the future. Youth engagement should never be tokenistic. With the TPNW entering into force any day now, we're facing a historic moment. It's important more than ever that young people are part of this movement. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anna Ikeda. What you said is very important. Lastly, I give the floor to Ronald Tatenda Magomo, representative of the African Union Youth Front and the Southern Africa Youth Forum, presenting on youth activism and promoting the TPNW. You now have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. And like you rightfully said, my name is Ronald Tatenda Magomo, and I'm with the Southern Africa Youth Forum, as well as the Africa Youth Front on COVID-19, which is a high-level policy framework that has been put in place by the African Union to coordinate the responses by African youth with regards to the coronavirus. And thank you also for giving me this opportunity to share, our reflections, especially on the role of African youth in terms of disarmament. So, like the earlier presenters have already, alluded to the critical role that young people must play and do play in terms of nuclear, weapons disarmament. In the African continent and context, what I must also begin by highlighting is that when you talk to young people and you are mentioning something around nuclear weapons, young people within the African continent have this view that nuclear weapons are only, for the Western nations and not necessarily the African continent. But what we must also, unpack and underline is that even within the African context, the use now of small arms and light weapons, continue to be on the increase. And if you also look at the statistics, you also realize that young people within the African continent are also, the mainly used perpetrators who are given, such small arms and light weapons to also, engage in acts of violence and also radical extremism. If you look at, for example, your Western Africa and even the Eastern African regions within the African continent, you also find out that most of these, African states, the majority of the populations within these countries are young people. And it is actually the young people who are also used as the perpetrators of violence and extremism within their own countries. And what we have also noted is that the reasons for why young people continue to be used as tools of violence and also radicalism, or, a result of socio-economic as well as political marginalization, the high levels of unemployment and also underemployment within these countries. And some of these problems are not only unique, for example, to West or Eastern Africa, but these are challenges that are, across the African continent as a whole. Then, with regards to nuclear weapons, South Africa was also the only country that had embarked on a journey to build nuclear weapons within the African continent. But in 1990, 1991, it also voluntarily, disarmed such weapons, and only in 2009, it also voluntarily, ratified the treaty, to abolish the use of nuclear weapons. And even within the African continent itself, the agenda to disarm, the disarmament agenda of nuclear weapons has always been high on the, on the agenda of the African continent. You look at back from 1964, the Organization of the African Unity, where it also, signed, for example, the Cairo Declaration, where it was also trying to look at how best do we ensure that we have in Africa that is also free, of nuclear weapons. So one thing to also note is that Africa continues to be, the highest producer of uranium, which is also utilized, in the establishment of nuclear weapons. Although, uranium can actually be used for positive, uses, which also include, electricity generation, among others. So, as the African continent now is young and it is youthful, then the question becomes, what then, must the African youth do in terms of disarmament agenda? And young people can play and are also playing a number of initiatives to, drive the sustainable peace agenda, the disarmament agenda, among other peace building initiatives. And one of the critical things that we also need to underline is that young people within the African continent must also be at the center, of providing critical information and education that relates to, disarmament and the abolition of nuclear weapons within the context of the African continent. And apart from that, that also involves, issues around unpacking more, especially on the treaty, on the treaty of the abolition of nuclear weapons that is set to be, into full force, as the earlier presenters have also talked about. Because in the African continent, we also need our young people to be at the center of engaging in peer-to-peer, engagement, where we are also, providing more information about this treaty and how young people can actually play a positive role in terms of advancing this agenda, and also playing that watchdog role to ensure that their states or their countries are also supporting this treaty that shall be into force a very short moment. Then another thing that we also must be talking about is the need for intergenerational co-leadership. So as young people, this is also one thing that we have often been speaking about, to say is African youth, most of us are also excluded and marginalized from decision-making processes, and hence the need for intergenerational co-leadership, where young people are also given spaces in decision-making to also bring to the decision-making table the youthful ideas that also relates to young people, remains very important. And this is also one key role that young people must also be playing in terms of advancing the disarmament agenda. Then apart from that, I also noted the need for the African youth to also recognize what I have then termed disarmament, African youth disarmament champions, because I've also acknowledged the fact that even the United Nations itself has had an effort or initiatives to try and engage with young people who are also within the African continent in the work that these African youth are also doing to push for sustainable peace, as well as the disarmament agenda. And that recognition also of the efforts of African youth and what they are also doing in their own communities to push for sustainable peace and the disarmament agenda also remains very, very important. Then what I also noted is part of the key roles that young people within the African continent must also play is the need for African youth to support initiatives that are also launched at a continental level. And in this regard, this can also include, for example, the 2020 African Union Theme of the Year, which is also silencing the guns. And what silencing the guns as an initiative seeks to do is also to build broadly on a conflict-free Africa, where we also harness on the energy and potential of our African youth. And also going down from there, the Office of the Youth Envoy, being led by the African Union Youth Envoy, Miss Ichebi, she's also leading this particular campaign, specifically with the Youth Silencing the Guns campaign. And this is also an initiative that young people within the African continent must also support and cascade it from that continental level and down to the community level, where these young people will also be leading their own initiatives. Why? Because this silencing the gun, Youth Silencing the Guns campaign by the Office of the Youth Envoy, being led by the AU Youth Envoy, Ms. Ichebi, what it also seeks to do is to support initiatives, peace-building initiatives that seeks to silence the guns. You are talking of silencing, climate crisis. You are talking of silencing gender-based violence. You are talking of silencing youth unemployment, among a wider array of challenges that young people within the African continent are actually facing. And as part of this particular campaign, what I'm also, advocating for is for young people to support it and to be part of it, as it also seeks to support interventions by, African youth, which are also innovative in a way, as they also relate to the silencing the guns, the guns agenda. So most importantly, the African continent's population is young, and us as the young people within the African continent, the time for us to take ownership, especially of the disarmament agenda, is now. And on the 21st of September, we also marked the International Day of Peace, and the theme for this particular day was to shaping peace together. And what we also realize and emphasize as the youth from the African continent is that the SDG number 16, the United Nations resolution, Security Resolution 2250, and the recently adopted UN Security Council Resolution 2535 all emphasize on the important role that young people have in terms of building sustainable peace. And I believe together through solidarity, even with young people who are outside of the African continent, together we'll be able to advance this treaty on the abolition of the use of nuclear weapons, as well as building sustainable peace for our continent and the world at large. I believe a world that is free of nuclear weapons is very possible, and together we can achieve it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Representative Ronald. Now we will proceed to group discussions, which are listed and included in the chat box. Each of you are welcome to choose a breakout room to enter. And to enter back into the main room, visit the initial link from Rinor Jani that you should have received when registering. In the conclusion of the breakout discussions, I am proud and deeply honored to then introduce elders from our First Nations. So I invite all to come back into the main room afterwards because you do not want to miss these important and wisdom-filled statements. Thank you and please proceed to the breakout rooms.
Hi, everybody. I think we'll give it another second or two to let people get sorted, I'm guessing. And then this will be the breakout session on Don't Bank on the Bomb and divestment. So everybody's welcome. It's wonderful to see folks. Great. So hi, everybody. My name's Susie Snyder, and I want to really thank folks for the invitation to be here today. Hopefully you can see my little bit of slides that I put together, just because for me it's a little easier to not look at talking heads in a screen all the time and maybe look at something else. You can choose what you like. You're also welcome to look at my bubbling head or just listen as you prefer. It's really great to be here, and it's such an amazing set of speakers today. And as I've just been listening to people from all over the world talk about the importance of banning nuclear weapons, the importance of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and the way that all of this inspires hope and gives us an opportunity to do something. And for those who, like, I've worked on the issues of nuclear weapons since the 90s, and I'm one of the kind of the old, pale, and stale folks talking about these issues. And I'll tell you, I have often felt really hopeless and really disempowered. And so when I hear so many people enthusiastic and excited and ambitious, I am inspired, and I'm so grateful for everybody who worked to put this together and to be able to offer just a little bit on this issue and talk a little bit about the stuff that I've been working on. There we go. I will do so. You should see my screen now, and it's just a PDF. I'll share it with the group, and I'll also drop some links into the chat as we go along. So first, You know, I think we're all looking for different ways to make the world we want. And there's lots of different tools. There's the legal tools we have talked about, the diplomatic tools around this treaty, around the negotiations. Another tool is to chase money and follow the money. And that's what I do. I go on the hunt to follow the money. Because as we heard earlier, we heard Maritza Chan talked about how there's $130,000 a minute being spent on the production and maintenance and modernization of nuclear weapons. And who gets that money? Where does it go? Well, it goes to private companies. And there's, you know, in private companies, there's this much money per minute being spent by governments, and they have contracts with private companies like Northrop Grumman, like Boeing, like ACOM, and Huntington Ingalls Industries to produce the key components necessary for nuclear weapons. In the chat now is the link on a list of where to find background information about these companies. And these companies, they have contracts, and the contracts are not just for a month or a year. Some of these contracts extend until 2030, 2040, 2050, 2070. Some of these contracts are for a really long time, and these are high level, very big dollar amount contracts. And so through Don't Bank on the Bomb, we publish information about the contracts. We go and dig deep, find out what it is that people are making, what they're doing, and we share that information, and that's on our website. And we found that there's $116 billion in outstanding contracts. And this is as of last year. The new numbers are coming out shortly. Now, you know, this contracts, again, they're with a lot of different companies, but not so many. It's not like when we're talking about fossil fuels and we're talking about climate change. It's entire sectors. When it comes to the production of nuclear weapons, at the end of the day, it's only about 30 companies or so that are involved. And with Trump's new nukes, there are companies that have specific contracts since Trump has pulled out of all of these different treaty arrangements. Companies like Aerojet Rocketdyne or BAE Systems have gotten extra contracts to make new components to make sure that nuclear weapons stay the deadliest weapon ever created. Now, the US is not the only country, of course, that makes nuclear weapons. And with our research, because I live in the Netherlands, and I think there's people from all over the world involved in this call, and it's great to see you. It's important to think of other companies as well, and other countries as well. So the UK, their propaganda around their own nuclear weapons system is all about their independent nuclear deterrence. That's the language they choose. They don't talk about the bombs that are on submarines that are designed to destroy cities in a flash, in a heartbeat. They talk about their independent deterrent. What most people don't know is that their independent deterrent is actually made in America. It's one of the few things maybe that's still, you know, produced almost wholly in the United States, but it is. And there are companies working on the US arsenal. Of them, only 2 are not US companies. They're working on the UK arsenal. And most of the companies involved in UK's nuclear weapons are US companies. It's important to keep this in mind as we talk about the complexity behind the nuclear weapons issue. Of course, everybody knows there's nuclear bombs, American nuclear bombs that are in Europe. On Saturday, we had a nice big demonstration at the Dutch air base that hosts 20 of these. And the companies that are building the new bombs that are meant to come to my area are companies Boeing, Huntington Ingalls Industries, and Honeywell International. Because Honeywell doesn't just make thermostats, they also make key components for nuclear weapons. Of course, we also publish information about the companies involved in the Indian nuclear arsenal, where we've been able to find information. And I wanted to share that with you today. Larsen and Toubro has been involved in a lot of weapons production, Bharat Dynamics as well. And Walsh and Nagar has also been involved in production of key components for the Agni series of missiles. And this is just, again, it's a global issue. So it's good to keep track of where the money's flowing globally. Now, one of the tools that we want to use, Alicia talked about this a little bit, that the ban treaty will have an impact out on countries that haven't signed it yet. One of the ways it will have an impact is on the financial institutions investing in the companies that make nuclear bombs and make the key components for nuclear bombs. And we found last year that it's about $748 billion in investment in those companies. And that's a lot of money. And I want to be really clear. The amount of money invested has gone up over the last few years, but because of the successful efforts of campaigners all around the world, because of the successful negotiations of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the actual number of institutions investing, the banks, the pension funds investing, is much less. And it has been consistently going down. So while the share price may go up, the total number of shareholders is going down. And that is because of efforts of people like you and hopefully me, with any luck. Some of the bigger shareholders that have made it really clear they will not invest in any companies associated with nuclear weapons have also adopted key policies to make sure that they don't get any exposure to nuclear weapon producers. So I listed here some of the top financial institutions. We found last year that there's about 1.6 trillion euros of assets under management. So you figure there's about $10 trillion. I'll speak in dollars. There's about $10 trillion in the world that are invested right now. About 10% of that is excluded from the nuclear weapons industry completely. And some of the big pension funds that have made these decisions said that they did so because of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. ABP, which is the pension fund that's used by Dutch civil servants, they said in January 2018, well, they adopted a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, time for us to divest. And earlier this year, they did a report and an analysis showing because of that decision, they have had no negative financial impact. And that's important because a lot of times we hear the excuse, oh, well, you know, if we divest, we'll lose money. Well, the reality is, so far, that has not been the case. So we're really happy to see some of these great financial institutions that have avoided any investment in the production of nuclear weapons, and we hope to see more of them in the future. Since the ban treaty was adopted, the number has been steadily going up, and we had 57 when the treaty was adopted, and we're at 77 now. And these are just the institutions that we have identified. There are still more, and we know there are more out there. So if you know, if your bank or your retirement fund or whatever is divesting from nuclear weapon producers, please tell us. We'd love to talk to them and ask them questions and find out if they belong in our Hall of Fame. One of the best things that will happen with the treaties entering into force is a lot of financial institutions already say they will not put their money into controversial weapons. Those are weapons deemed illegal under international law. So it's almost across the board. People say no landmines, no cluster bombs, too controversial, not for us. They say it about biological weapons. They say it about chemical weapons. And now with the ban treaty, we're giving them the power to say it about nuclear weapons. This is really exciting, and it's a great step for us overall. And I imagine that as the treaty enters into force, the numbers of financial institutions excluding nuclear bomb builders is just going to grow and grow and grow. But at the end of the day, what does it mean for you and me? And what can I actually do? So we figured out a couple of things that anybody can do. I mean, if you have a bank account, or you're connected to a bank, or you're part of a church that has a bank account, or you're at university and your university has an endowment, or you have a friend or cousins who have bank accounts, find out more about them. You can also do something that very few people do anymore. And you can pick up the phone and you can call your bank. And I'll tell you what, it freaks them out and it changes how they look at this question. And we have answered a lot of questions about how to establish a good policy because people like you have picked up the phone or walked into the bank office and said, what's your policy around nuclear weapons? And I just dropped a helpful script. If you want to try to give them a call, into the chat. A lot of people don't want to call. A lot of people prefer to write a letter, write an email, do a Facebook post. Facebook can change the way that, that banks look at their clients. We can raise a ruckus and use that ruckus to raise our voices against nuclear weapons. There's some more tips and tricks I just dropped in the chat about how to elevate your voice to end nuclear weapons and the production of nuclear weapons and cut off the money. And thank you very much. I think that we're about to go back into or we'll soon go back. I'll stop sharing my screen. And if there are any questions, please drop them in the chat or let me know. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Susie. That was an amazing presentation. Would anyone like to volunteer themselves to become a speaker in presenting what Susie discussed in this breakout room?
I see Anne.
Okay, Anne.
Well, I see. My credit card is with Capital One, and I think they are investing in nuclear weapons. I think the biggest reason I don't is because I already memorized my credit card number, and I'm just too lazy to learn another one. That's about my biggest excuse. But I still don't know where to go. What's a credit card I can get that doesn't invest in nuclear weapons, or their parent company doesn't invest? And it's the same question about Bank of America, because Rotary International uses Bank of America. And we'd like to be able to say to them, I know it's hard to switch. I'm sure it's very complicated. Why don't you switch to blah, blah, blah? It's as simple as that.
Well, and just very quickly, as to your personal credit card, I don't want to, make you memorize a new number. Those numbers are long. I always flip them around in my head. I'm terrible that way. But it is something, because you are a client, you have a certain voice and strength as a client that me, who doesn't have a credit card with Capital One, doesn't have. So you can use that voice as a client and say, hey, do you want to keep me? You're making money off of me. If you want to keep making money off of me, start switching. Similarly, if you're looking for financial institutions that don't have any investments, we're not in a spot where we can poll every institution. We go by what companies they do invest in, not who doesn't invest. But for some institutions, especially those who are in the eastern part of the U.S., that are looking for institutions that don't invest and maybe work well with labor unions, work well with social justice issues. Amalgamated has been very good on this, and they were one of the first to come out in the US to say, no, we won't have any investments. So it's worth checking out. I can't give you any financial advice. That is not my role, and I am not giving you any financial advice, but there's always folks out there. Similarly, there are other ways to move on this issue aside from your personal finances. So if you yourself can't quite make the switch, or you have issues, you can't do it yourself, you can always work through your city, for example. And within New York City, there is legislation, Chuck has reminded in the chat, there's currently legislation pending. It has a supermajority of support. It just needs to be voted that will effectively divest New York City's 5 pension funds from any companies associated with the production of nuclear weapons. And now they did this with public prisons or with private prisons a few years back. And because of that, there was a switch in the way the state engaged with the prison system and stopped using private companies for prisons, and it had a social impact. It created social change. So New York City knows that this is a way to move things forward. They just haven't yet had the chance to take the vote. And that's something anybody can do, and I'll drop some more info in the chat. Thank you so much, Anne, and thanks everyone for your attention.
Thank you, Susie, again. If you could, I think Rinor included in the chat, if you could just feel free to be the speaker, if that is okay for you. And I think now everyone is returning to the main room. I will give it just a few more seconds for people to come in. Okay, so I will just start while people enter the main room again. Yes, I will start. So thank you all for returning to the main room. I now invite you all to shift your focus towards our second topic, collaborating with First Nations. As I said previously, I'm revered to introduce Professor Esther Yazdi Lewis, co-author of The Navajo People and Uranium Mining, University of New Mexico. You now have the floor, Esther. Esther, you are muted. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Navajo, and I'm here to talk about the Navajo experience with uranium mining and what it has done to Navajo people. And I'm going to read out of a book called Tortured Science, because I think it sums up what I wrote at one time about Navajo people and uranium. And it has to do with the Navajo activist perspective on uranium research and ethics. And it goes like this. It is apparent that research studies conducted by the uranium companies did not include the community people. There was no inclusion of individuals who knew the language, who worked with the companies to explain and educate the Navajo men on the dangers of uranium. Safety precautions were not performed, such as using safety face masks and disregarding work clothes and related contaminated garments. Any resource extracting research, health impact research, or communicable disease study that does not involve community representatives, for example, oversight communities, is highly questionable and suspect. The research must be held to a certain standard of public health and safety when human lives are at risk. It has been proven time and time again that corporate interests and public interests are not one and the same. The questions are, who has the power and authority to initiate research? What is the purpose of the research? Who benefits from the outcome of the research? There are the corporations who have an interest in uranium for various reasons to accommodate this country's industry and the military. Department of Defense, i.e. National Defense and Homeland Security. It is the corporation versus the community people. The corporations know about the dangers of the uranium. The federal government knows. The industry has a demand of uranium. The Navajo people in this case took on employment of mining uranium without fully understanding the health and safety risks involved, the need for income for their only reason. There are many of our rural, unsophisticated communities that still remain vulnerable to the unethical research practices of corporate America. It must be said that these small rural communities cannot compete with corporate America researchers who come into their communities armed with ulterior motives, unconformed data, and untested methods to convince these people that the corporations are actually looking out for their interests. In fact, they use uncorroborated scientific data, graph charts, bells and whistles designed to confuse and exploit these people. With respect to their research about health, for example, in Crown Point, New Mexico, the company met with the people to inform them that in-situ leach mining was safe. The company informed the people that they had developed a new way of mining uranium so that it would not contaminate their grazing land and water. If the people allowed this, their groundwater would be contaminated. Knowing the people are poor, companies dangle dollars in front of these community people to convince the poor. Companies dangle dollars in front of the community people to convince them it is economic development for them. The corporation knew, but did not inform the Navajo community people of the dangers uranium may cause. The federal government knew, but did not ensure health and safety compliance for Navajo miners. By and large, the issue of uranium mining is driven by greed and super profits. The United States government is the official regulator agency of all uranium mine and process in America. So how complicit is the relationship between those that have the capital to invest in uranium mining, those researchers that are sent into the fields to soften up the people with uncollaborated data, those that mine and process uranium, those that supply uranium to industry, energy complexes, and the Department of Defense? These are critical questions that must be answered when we explore the relation dynamics on the question of research ethics. What is ethical? Ethical is that which conforms to the concept principles of right and wrong that govern the conduct of a profession. There is a health-related legislation enacted to protect the people of the country. But who are the people that are unprotected? There have been so many violations of the people's protection under the law, and one can hardly keep up with the atrocities. The federal government has developed basic principles that should guide researchers and establish ethic review committees to oversee the research. These guidelines are supposed to give some moral standard to both parties in the research. However, corporations in most cases seem to have the upper hand with their high-tech scientists doing the research and intimidating the grassroots communities. The question that must be asked include, who were regulations made for? What is fair about them? The injustice of research and the decision which derive from the research cause communities to take a defensive position to fight their rights. For example, Crown Point community people have come together to fight the in-situ leach mining imposed on their land. The community people have formed an organization called Eastern Navajo Against Uranium Mining, INDOM, a nonprofit grassroots community-based public interest organization. INDOM fears the in-situ leaching mining will contaminate their drinking water. The aquifer is the principal source of water in the area of the desert on Navajo land. INDOM has been fighting the mining company for over 10 years, and they joined forces with Southwest Research and Information Center, SRIC, in Albuquerque, New Mexico, to strengthen their efforts. SRIC has provided technical research support to INDOM by supporting the organization in scientific geological knowledge, but also assist the community's interest in stopping the mining. Sometimes it would appear to be a never-ending battle, in spite of all their efforts and sometimes no encouragement from the people they represent. Nevertheless, their collaborative managed to sustain resistance by continuing to find ways to educate the community on the dangers of uranium. One important project in the initiative is the DNE project. As described above, its purpose is to document water quality in 20 Navajo chapters in Eastern Navajo Agency. The water use survey of unregulated water wells, windmills, and springs will be conducted and was conducted through 2004 and 2008. It is a long drawn out process. However, they are determined to accomplish this research on their own without corporate or government interference. The Navajo people in Crown Point area have become suspect of corporate interest in the new uranium mining. Hydro Resource Inc., the HRI, the primary company promoting renewed mining, has continued to preserve over 17 years in their quest to open in-situ leach mining in Church Rock and Crown Point. SREC hired Navajo liaison assistants to help INDOM in their fight. The Navajo liaison, Harris Arthur, understood the grassroots people and asserted that the Navajo legislation had to be changed. He met with the people and they put together a proposal for legislation change to ban uranium mining and processing. And with the help of Councilman George Arthur, the brother of the late Harris Arthur, sponsoring the legislation under the Natural Resource Act of 2005, the legislation has presented to the Navajo Nation and the law was passed to ban uranium. However, even with the Navajo ban on uranium mining, HRI continues to lobby. The New Mexico Environment Department, the Navajo people represented in INDOM, recently traveled to Washington to lobby Congress to respect the Navajo ban on uranium. Navajo Nation President Joe Shirley has taken a stand to support the law and has been recognized around the world for banning uranium. Still, Eastern Navajos are not feeling secure. The fight goes on to a lack of understanding by the federal government and state government as to why land and water is so important to Navajo people. Navajo people believe by culture they are a part of nature. Land is what most indigenous people depend on to provide their existence. They are connected spiritually by being connected to every element, creature, and plant, even the rocks which have lived in some point in time. Land is the lifeblood of the people, a gift from the Creator that provides all that is necessary to sustain life. I want to add on to this. Southwest Research has been an instrumental piece to the Navajo uranium mining impact, and many Navajo people have died from the mining through the studies that we have with Southwest Research and the University of Medical Center, who has collaborated together to do water study, health study, air study, kidney study, liver study, now the birth cohort study. After I was thinking this morning, for about 40 to 50 years, Navajo people have been mining, and the Navajo people that were affected today with the birth cohort study, it's brought to my attention that they are interviewing and working with Navajo young women, about 200 of them, who were pregnant and who have given birth to babies, and the urine study of the babies still have impact of uranium and radiation effects and elements like that within their urine, that still says there is a longevity of impact for Navajo people. And these are studies that have been taking place with Southwest Research and with the help of the university and Navajo people that are out there that speak the language, that work with Navajo people, that know how to explain all the research and the lab results. And one of the things that have happened in recently is that how do they, with all the imbalance of the chemicals that have been affected within the body, what is the solution to helping people find some kind of solution to help them to sort of balance out their own chemistry? And that was the study of zinc helping Navajo people to balance out their own personal chemistry, to sort of give them some relief that there might be something there to help them out. And I think a lot of times Navajo people have been an example of what uranium can do, and with all the life that has been taken and with all the health effects that have affected Navajo people, it's been an important study for the rest of indigenous countries around the world that are affected by uranium, and why today the pathway to peace is so important with young people who have come together to say, we want to ban this nuclear weapon and make it a treaty and make it a world process to stop this uranium and quit making weapons, because the uranium that was mined back in the 40s by Navajo people were the uranium that was made into nuclear bombs. And I know that Navajo people said, if we knew it was going to be made for weapons and to destroy people, we would have never minded the uranium, because Navajo people are about peace and harmony and beauty, and to walk on this earth and to appreciate Mother Earth and Father Sky and the sun and the moon and all the life elements of air, water, and sun and moon, and just everything in life, because that's the way Navajo people believe, and that's the way they live with the elements of nature. That much I have to say, and I appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak here, and I appreciate the young people and their efforts to put together this treaty.
Thank you so much, Professor Esther Yazzie-Lewis. I now have the pleasure to invite Strong Buffalo, Executive Director and Indigenous Director.
I am Tatako Hitika, Strong Buffalo. I am a Sisituan Wapetuan Dakota. Dakota interpretation of what we call ourselves is the friendly people. Because we were told by God to live in a friendly way with all that is living. I like and appreciate Esther's words telling you about the Dene. I'm going to try to connect you. I was born here in Minnesota, the Dakota.
Please, everyone mute. Thank you.
Honeywell is one of our neighborhood stores. Two, I'm going to try to talk in general ways. To colonize a country, you have to take the territory and the lands. You have to take the natural resources. You have to take away the sovereignty, disrupt the leadership and governance of those before. You have to take away the legitimacy of their thoughts, their worldview and their language, their spirituality and their healing. And you have to take away their children. We call them lost birds. I am one of those taken children. I was taken away from my mother 1 year after the bombs in Japan. I am a mixed blood Dakota. I am indigenous here to this land, and my father was an American soldier who I believe was of Japanese descent. So that war I am a child of. I began this life not being told who or what I was. For the first 15 years of my life, I did not know what nationality or what I was. When I was 15, they told me that I was a Dakota Sioux, and it meant little. But every brown woman that went by me, I looked to see if it was my mother. I found out after I returned from Vietnam, my blood family. And on my way to meet them, I ran across the Minneapolis police throwing Indians into paddy wagons and saw that they had been brutalizing them. The same force that has killed George Floyd so brutally. I joined the American Indian movement. I began to see other Indians around the country and listen to them. We took over the BIA building in Washington, D.C., the first people to take over a government facility of the United States. I am descendant of people that were the first people that the United States treated peace with us. We know treaties well. We know that treaties have to be bilaterally and mutually agreed upon. And that most of the treaties that we have dealt with have not been mutually agreed upon by the United States. I also know from my work with the AIM and the International Treaty Council, which is an NGO of the United Nations, that 3,000 indigenous nations are within 180 industrial nations, and that we are marginalized and people without a voice. That we are affected totally by the nuclear circle from the beginning to the end. We advocated to leave uranium in the ground because once you break it out of its natural form, the poison enters. It's a bomb. Our whole world has been nuked. We are investing and divesting little. It has, and we are prime examples of the marginalization and the inhumanity to the humanity. We who represent and speak for those and what has no voice, because we are one with it. We have a relationship with the earth, and it is our mother, and the sky is our father. We know these people with nuclear stuff. They think they're so smart with their cruise missiles that they're throwing up with nuclear. They can't even deal with their waste, much less the proliferation. I, as a great-grandfather, ask you, and am proud that you young people are beginning to see that the world has changed. It's not the same world we had just at the beginning of this year. The paradigm has shifted. The world has changed, and we can change it. We need to stand up. We had prophecies from our own people, the hope he told of the gourd of ashes that would fall upon us, and that we were to begin to live in a time of chaos. The Dakota, we had a Messiah that was a woman that came and brought the peace pipe to us. She said she would return again. That's we would know it was a time because there would be famine, fires and floods and huge storms and wars going on in the world. That time is now. She said we would know also that we had gone too far and that we needed to talk. We as human beings, us two-legged, had to begin to talk with each other. We have to change what's going on in the world. Governments and corporations and rich people do not speak for us. We are the humans. We are the relatives that need to join hands and begin to talk and change this world. Because it is us, all of us, from the youngest to the oldest, from throughout this world that need to change it. I, as one soul little person, appreciate so much your efforts and all the efforts that are going on. We are the ones that are in power. For the higher authorities know what we're doing. It's been prophesied. They came and they told us what we are doing is right. And so I'm so bold as maybe to say, let us pray at this moment that we can stop their weapons, their bombs. This nuclear is just the tip of what is going on wrong in the world today. We are what is good in this world today. So don't stop. Stand up, speak out, do what you can to save this world, because it is us who's doing it wrong, and it is us who has to correct it. Thank you so much.
I deeply thank you, Strong Buffalo of Oyati Hotaini, which translates to Voice of the People, as he said in his remarks. I thank both of our First Nation panelists for their statements and remarks. And what they have to say is very important, because they are on the grounds living this, living the results of what is now with nuclear weapons. But I now open the floor to the discussion with the audience. If anyone has any questions, please include it in the chat, and I will direct it to each panelist, if specific to a panelist. I will give a moment for you to do so, and then I will begin. Thank you. Okay. Question number 1 I received: how can we come together to shift the discourse towards human security? I open it to any panelists that spoke previously, if you would like to answer.
Talk to each other. From relatives, with all that is living. That sounds simple, but It's pretty hard when we speak different languages and we're different places. We have this stuff like Zoom that brings us instant communications. So hello, my relatives. Let's stop these bombs. Let's make our nations do it and divest all this.
Yes, I agree. Thank you so much, Strong Buffalo. I also received another one. Will there be a follow-up Zoom meeting? We are looking forward to doing that, and you will be notified after this meeting as a follow-up. So yes. I also received another question. How can we get the abolition of nuclear weapons on the global stage via social media and the youth and elders joining hands? There must be some organization like ICAN that can bring together a global peace concert. The global media wouldn't be able to ignore it. Blessings to all peacemakers. Thank you for that question. If any one of the panelists would like to answer that, you are free to do so. The question is also in the chat to everyone.
Okay, is there someone who is trying to respond to that?
Yeah, this was Susie. I was gonna
Okay,
jump
yeah,
in, but go ahead. But no, Ronald, go ahead, please.
Okay, no, thank you very much, and thank you also to the person who has also raised the question. And I think I also touched a bit in terms of the energy that young people have. Noting that we are, a youthful population that has also gone digital, and there are a lot of, initiatives that young people are actually doing, via the digital platforms that can actually also bring, especially this treaty on the global scale. You look at, for example, your Black Lives Matter, hashtag that went viral using the digital platform, and look at how that particular space is also dominated by young people. And as part of especially the role that young people can play, I had also noted that young people have that huge role to play in terms of harnessing the power that they also possess, within the digital spaces, to ensure that they advance the disarmament agenda, as well as the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. But it will also demand solidarity, where young people, despite where you are, be it in the African continent or outside, we all need to to gather around the same space, especially the digital platforms. Now that also the COVID-19 has also taught us that there are no borders. We are actually one, and we can actually achieve if we definitely work together. So definitely young people need to be at the center of utilizing social media and the digital platforms, as well as the new technologies, to advance this agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else like to speak? I know someone else wanted to answer. We do have time for another answer to the same question. If not, I will proceed. Another question will be, what kind of support, and I think this is directed to the First Nation panelists, what kind of support would be most helpful from white settlers
Betsabe, I believe that you froze for a minute. Let's just give her a moment. Otherwise, I can ask the question.
know, with what Strong Buffalo said, first contact, colonization, and the taking over of this country from Native people. The guilt that's there to see how, you know, the Europeans came here and took over the land and how they massacred Indian people in the way that they did, and the signing of the treaties that were not really honored. I think with today's understanding of Native people and Western ways and the government, I think it's hard to me, I think it's hard for a white person to really assist in it, because the ancestors, their white ancestors, are the ones that have devastated the whole culture of Native people. And the only way might be to assist in the research, in the technical assistance of exposure and doing that. And I only say that because Dr. Doug Brugge, who I work closely with in writing the transcripts of Navajo people who gave their stories of what happened. His study we put together was called, it's a hold on, I'll give you the proper title. It's called the title of it is Memories Come to Us in Rain and Wind. And it's the oral history and photographs of Navajo uranium miners and their families. And so my point to that is that white people can assist in helping to expose those stories and educate and do research and analogy on that level to help, you know, assist in making things, to present things in a technical and scientific way. And that's why the book is called Tortured Science, because, you know, you like I said, there's two types of scientists. There's scientists for the companies and the government, and then we need the scientists for the indigenous people, for the Native American people, for the disenfranchised people of all over the world. And I know I went to Africa, to Mali, to Bamako, to talk about uranium and how the people were going to be, the companies were coming in to Urane with their uranium mining, and the people that were affected. The only thing I could tell them was that their story and their resistance was just the story that Navajo people know so well about what happened to them with uranium. And the only thing I could give them was to say that they have to find a contact, a root, a way to hang on to your land. For us, it was, we love the land. We treat our Mother Earth with respect. We treat our water with respect. We treat the air with respect. And those kind of things really have an impact on our way of thinking, which is totally the opposite of how European people think. European people, white people want profits and stuff like this. And I think those kind of studies could really, and research like that could really help Native people. With EPA too, and their super funds out in a place called Cameron, Arizona. And in Cameron, Arizona, they don't have the right kind of vegetation. It's all contaminated. People have to haul in their water because Navajo people have abandoned mines, and everything is so contaminated. They can't, their animals are contaminated, vegetations are contaminated. Same way with Church Rock, with the spill. People are moving out. They can't use their land anymore. So people who have the expertise in doing this kind of research, I think is where white people can assist in their studies and their effort. And I see young people doing that, because I had 2 young people that came over and did a videotape on me regarding uranium and trying to educate, you know, everybody, not just Native people or Navajo people, but the whole society on what's happening with this uranium and how contaminated and how dangerous it is and how it's not good. And I want to end with this because when I was doing the transcription of Navajo people, they said, and everything is fossil fuel. From my understanding through scientific studies of the Western world, oil and gas and coal and everything is fossil fuel. So is uranium. Uranium is a fossil fuel of the reptiles. So as Navajo people, we're supposed to respect those things, and we don't go and dig around and disrupt these things that have been dormant. So it has affected us in those ways. So I think with white society, they need to just help us, you know, find a defense mechanism to research and make these things possible for Native Americans and indigenous people all around the world.
Thank you, Professor Esther Yazzie Lewis, for that very knowledgeable response to the question. On behalf of Pathways to Peace and our co-sponsors, TPNW, Peace Boat US, Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, and ICAN, infinite gratitude to each of you. Let us continue to reaffirm the principles in which the United Nations stands in our quest to eliminate all nuclear weapons and protect the future of humankind and the earth. For those of you who have come forward to be a part of this noble movement, we thank you. To those of you considering doing so, we encourage you to make your interests known to us. The future is you. In conclusion, I have the utmost pleasure to hand the floor over to Christian Giovanno from Nuclear Age Peace Foundation to give his last remarks.
So hello, everyone. Apologies for the lighting here. I would like to thank all of our esteemed speakers today. We've heard from diplomats talking about the TPNW, the negotiations, activists highlighting the need for young people and elders to work together, as well as the involvement among African youth, which is very important. To the importance, and I actually want to thank both Strong Buffalo and Professor Esther Yazzie Lewis for talking about, you know, the First Nations. I think it is very crucial when we talk about nuclear disarmament to have an array of voices, from those who are involved in negotiations to those who have witnessed and who are part of communities that have experienced the tragic humanitarian and environmental impacts of nuclear weapons. I think it is time for us to really think about and to dive in about the importance of human security. It is essential that we continue to shift the discourse towards that, you know, trajectory, that we change how nuclear weapons are discussed. And I think that this webinar, which we organize, you know, today with our esteemed partners, and we thank everyone for being on it, is really a step towards that, you know, direction. We have to continue to be, we have to continue to have discussions with all relevant, you know, actors, including, you know, hearing from, you know, communities that have, you know, witnessed, you know, the impact of nuclear weapons. So on that note, I would like to thank everyone for participating in this webinar. And I would like to thank all of our speakers today for taking the time out of their busy schedules to share their stories, to share presentations, and to really contribute to a very meaningful discussion. Thank you once again, and I'm looking forward to continuing this discussion in subsequent webinars. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. This concludes an intergenerational approach to advancing the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Please refer to the chat for any information. Thank you.